I mean, JS Ben's kind of trash, and so were some of the other things, just in terms of their functionality, and Cloud9 looked like the best one. You know, I liked it even better than Replit and blah, 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 but.
Well, if you think about what Cloud9 is trying to accomplish, I mean, it's pretty impressive what they're trying to do with that software. So it's like, you know, I feel like they're doing it just about as well as anyone out there as far as like a cloud-based, you know, IDE that folks can share. You know, so it's pretty well done for what it is, I think. So in our next like 20 minutes, let's talk about some advanced inline layout techniques. Specifically, we want to talk about the float property and the calc property with CSS. So let's knock these out before lab time in about 20 minutes. So let's talk about the float property. So imagine that we had an image and we wanted to have text wrap around it like a newspaper. The float property was originally created to handle just this. So I'm going to bring back my handy. So does anyone remember what this thing's called? This is a newspaper. And just as an example of kind of what the float accomplishes for us, so you see here in the middle we have this image, and we have text on either side, and it's as if the text, the heart, you know, or the body of this article, the text just kind of wraps really nicely around this image. So it just floats around it. So that's essentially what the CSS float property is accomplishing for us in a web layout scenario. So that's what we're going to take a look at. The original use for the float property, it had two values, left and right. So if you want to force text to begin on the line below a floated element, stop floating, i.e. stop floating, you can use the clear left, clear right, or clear both. So clear is a property that will kind of stop that floating behavior. And enough yapping, let's do an exercise and check this out. So we're going to do this. You can do this in the Cloud9 workspace from this morning. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to share my screen and do a clean slate with my workspace. So let me get rid of this style.css. And I'm going to clean up, sanitize my HTML here. A lot of lorem ipsum here. Cool. Yeah, so if you guys just want to make a little bit of real estate here, that'd be great. And I'll refresh, and we should have a blank canvas. Cool, so we'll walk through this together. The first thing we want to do is I want you guys to create an image tag. So go out on Google Images, just pick an image, and place an image tag with that image into your body. I will do the same. I'm on my Riri kick today. Oops, so I'm gonna find a good Rihanna pic. I mean, they're all pretty good, but try to find one that's not super large here. Okay, this is like 300 by 300, so. If you want to get a larger image, that's cool. You can also put height and width properties on the image tag, and it'll just kind of constrain it, just so I can see it in here. Make sure I copy the URL. So in here, my body, I'll do IMG and hit tab. And again, Cloud9, it's kind of interesting that it gives you that closing image tag, which we don't need. So if we want to be super proper, we can just get rid of that. And I will paste in that URL into the source attribute on my image tag, and we'll have an image there. After you do that, let's add some placeholder text. So below the image, I'm not even going to put this in a p tag or anything, just for this example. I'll do lorem again and just throw some text in there. So I put this text right under that image tag. And then to see this float property in action, let's have the placeholder text flow around the right side of our image. So the image is on the left side of the page, the text is going to flow up on the right. So the way that we can do that is let's add a float property to our image tag. So image tags are block elements, right? So it's one of those elements that is a diva, it demands the stage, it has to have its own space in the browser. So the float property is essentially a way to change that default behavior for a block element. So let's do a float and let's put a left in there. Spell that right. And let's see if this works correctly. Actually, what we want to do, this should be right because we're saying let stuff. Oops, I got it backwards. Well, we can start with right, that's fine. So we're putting this float property on the image tag. So it's making the image tag float to the right of the screen. It's actually going to go all the way to the right, kind of to the edge of the browser, to the edge of the body. And then that float allows any other elements to float around it. So we can see that the text kind of flows up to the left-hand side of that image. Even though the text in our HTML, the text is actually below the image tag, right? But when we use that float property, it kind of ignores the sequence of events in the HTML, and it just lets the other elements flow in their natural state around this element, even if it appears below the element in the HTML, which is kind of interesting. And then if we wanted to see the opposite, if we wanted to see it, maybe the image on the left and the text on the right, we can change that float property to the value of left and refresh. And now the image is on the left and the text is on the right. So the float property, if you guys looked, I don't know if you inspected the CSS for the Windy Bite exercise, but there were a couple of float properties. Particularly, you had Betty White's photo, and then you had that text kind of flowing around it. So if you checked out the CSS of that site, this is how it was accomplished, was using floats. Cool. Any questions about the float? So that's what it does. If you want to think about a newspaper, that's kind of the gist and the kind of the spirit of what the float property is doing for us. All right. Here's a couple of caveats as it pertains to layout. And I'll put the screenshot into Slack there. So alternative use for layout. So certainly you can use float to line up block elements next to one another. So a really good example may be a nav bar, because a nav bar generally is going to be a UL. It's essentially going to be a UL, and like the links would be LIs, generally speaking, for most of your nav bars. So LIs are block elements, right? They stack on top of each other. But if you're creating a nav bar, you'd probably want the links to kind of line up next to each other, and a float property would be a very efficient strategy to do that. So issues with the float technique, however, are that all the elements in the line must have widths that do not add up to more than their container, or else they will wrap. So if you have a box that's maybe 100 px wide, and the elements within that box add up to be more than 100 px, then your stuff's going to wrap anyway. It's just going to float underneath each other. So just something to keep in mind. That's kind of an easy fix. Just make sure that the box model for those individual elements fit within the dimensions of an outer container or something. And number two, again, just some things to be aware of with floating. If you have a container with nothing but floated elements for content, the height of the container will be 0. even though the floated elements take up space within that container. We're going to see an example of this here shortly. And then to fix this, you have a couple of options which we're going to play with. You can put an empty div with clear both after all of your floated elements. You could also add overflow auto to the container and many others. So again, just kind of the greatest hits here if you want to investigate floats further. But that brings us to another little exercise period. So let's see this in action. So what I want you guys to do is let's create 4 div tags with some content inside, just some short content. And then make each of those tags 25% of the screen. So we'll use a percentage. And then we're going to use float to have them line up on the same line as each other. Okay? So I will do the same. I'm going to kind of sanitize my style.css. I'll also get rid of Rihanna, very sad. And I'm just going to create 4 div elements. So if you guys want to do that. Create 4 divs. Divs are block elements, right? So their behavior is they want to stack on top of each other. So we'll do div 1, div 2, div 3, and div 4. And I'll refresh the page. So you guys should see something like this. So nothing too fancy or crazy, just 4 boring divs stacked on top of each other. So we also want to make the width of each div 25% of the screen. And then we're going to put the float property on these divs. So we're going to create a rule down here in our style.css for our div selectors. So we'll start with div. Let's make the width 25%. And then let's do a float. We'll just do a float left here. And save that. And you guys should see this behavior. So now, again, the default behavior for divs, they want to stack on top of each other. But by using the float property, we can put them kind of in an inline fashion. So you guys should be seeing your 4 divs lined up next to each other. And each div should be taking up 25% of the browser width. Cool. So step 2, let's surround these div tags with a section tag that has a background color and a padding of 1 EM. So what I'm going to do is let's create a section tag. We'll put these divs inside this section tag. Then let's give it a background color. So you could do background or background color. I will give it yellow. And then we will also give it a padding of 1 EM. And just let me know if you guys want to copy any code into Slack if you're having any Cloud9 difficulty or anything. Cool. So there we have our 4 divs wrapped in a section tag with a yellow background. And so what I wanted to demonstrate here is we just talked about one of the problematic issues is if you have an element and the contents of that element are all floated elements, other floated elements, then you're not going to be able, that container div is going to have a height of 0. And so we can see that here. So the section tag that we just created, it contains 4 divs that are all floated. They all have the float left property. So for the section, we put a background of yellow, but we can't see the background, right? Because right now that background is actually has a height of 0 because the container only contains floated elements. So the background isn't really rendering. So this is something to keep in mind if you have a background image or maybe some sort of background color or something, and it's not rendering, just consider that if you have any kind of floated properties in there, that the background may be there, you just can't see it because you need to set a height property on it. In this case, I'm going to uncomment this padding. So in this case, we're just adding some padding, which is kind of the same thing. It's definitely adding some thickness to that section area. And so then when we refresh, that padding is actually creating some space so we can see that yellow background inside. Cool. Any questions about that? So another way that you could accomplish something like this is you could also use inline-block. So we talked about inline-block this morning. So inline-block will take block elements and it will kind of push them in line. There's a couple of subtle differences between using a float and using inline-block, the inline-block property. So inline-block elements are often preferable to a line of floated block elements. But inline-block elements have a problem also. If you have inline-block elements next to each other, there's often space between each element. And this is caused by the browser rendering the line breaks between each tag as a single space. So if you use inline-block, your browser is going to add, maybe it's like 1 px of space in between each element. And so you can use inline-block, but you just need to compensate for this issue. So let's take a look at how you can use inline-block and you can compensate for that extra space between each element. Here's another exercise for us. So let's go into our workspace. And this time, so we still have 4 div tags that exist, so that should work fine. We want to create 4 div tags, each 25% of the screen. But we're going to use display inline block instead of float. And then we're going to have to use some CSS hackery to have them line up on the same line as each other. So let's take a look at this in action. So you don't really need to touch the HTML. We can play around with these 4 divs. It'll be fine. But let's go into our div rule down here in our CSS. And let's get rid of the float. And instead, let's put in display inline block. Cool. So the only thing we changed was the display property. And you can see that now that 4th div is getting pushed or wrapped underneath the others. So it worked with float just fine, but with inline block, you can't see it, but there's actually just a little sliver of space in between each element. And so that's, pushing that last div underneath because there's not enough width, there's not enough room for all 4 of them. So let's do some CSS trickeration and clean that up. So one of the strategies that we can do is we can set the font size of a container to be 0 and then reset it for each element. So what does that mean? Well, let's see it in action. So the containing element for these 4 divs is our section tag. So let's go on to our section rule here in the style.css and go ahead and put font size as 0px. Oh goodness. So when we do that, our whole rendered body disappears. It's actually there. There's just no height associated with it. So we set the font size of 0 on our section tag. Now let's go into div, and let's put a font size on this font size property on this rule as well. So let's do a font size. I'll just do like 20px. We'll save that and refresh, and voila, my friends. Now we get the same behavior as if we used a float. So your 4 divs should now line up next to each other. You just have to do this little, kind of consider the font size consideration. There's some other ways around this too if you want to Google it, but just want to demonstrate inline block and float. They're very similar. Any questions about that? Cool. So the last thing I want to show you guys before we head into lab time, I'm actually going to send out some code for this. But I want to mention something called the calc property. This is a really cool property, and I just want you guys to be aware of it if it ever comes up. So what this calc property allows you to do is it allows you to use spacing when you want to combine 2 units of measure together. This is especially useful when the units of measure are different. So here's an example. If you have a fixed width element, like a logo in maybe a nav bar, if you have that element in line with elements that have a percentage width, so this calc really comes in handy. And I'm actually just going to slack out some code so we can see this example. So let me send you, it's actually kind of a mock-up of a nav bar. So I want you to paste this into the body of your HTML. And it's a little sloppy, but that's okay. So go ahead and paste that. And then I'm going to give you some CSS that you can totally replace your style.css file with. You can just paste this completely over what's already in there. Then I'll show you what this should look like. Sorry, let me actually paste in the CSS here. There you go. Cool. So I'm going to just totally overwrite all of my style.css with what I just slacked out. And I'm going to paste that nav HTML code that I slacked out, and I'm going to put that in my body here. So all of this section stuff, I'm just going to replace with that nav. And then let me refresh the page here. So hopefully you guys see something like this. And this is just an example to see that calc in action. But I want to show you what the CSS is doing. Give me a thumbs up if you guys are able to see something. You should see this cat and then 5 equally spaced, nice and floated kind of link boxes to the right of that cat image. Working! Cool. All right. So the idea with calc, again, is if you have elements that are of different units of measure, then calc is really handy to make them play nicely. For example, our crazy cat image right here, if you look in the CSS, it has a width of 200px. So it's not very flexible. This image is not going to stretch or change shape no matter how we play around in the browser, different sizes and stuff. This image is hard-coded at 200px. However, maybe we want the links up here in this nav bar to be responsive. So we want them to be fluid. We give them a width with percentages. And so a way to do that is using the calc. So if you look in the CSS in this UL rule, for width, we have this calc. And it looks a little bit like a function because it takes, kind of an argument. In this argument, this calc is saying, so take 100% of the browser, whatever that is, whether it's really wide, really small. Just use the percentage of whatever the browser size is at that moment, and then subtract 200px from it. So why are we subtracting 200px from 100% of the browser size, browser width? What is that going to do for us? Cat. Yeah, picture width. Yeah, so if we have some element that has a fixed width, you just subtract that in this calc. So 100% minus the width of that image, that's going to be the basis for the width of the rest of the elements. And then down here are LIs, if you look at the LI rule. So we have 5 LIs in our HTML, and right now the width is 20%. So once we do this calculation, we want those 5 LIs to equally take up the rest of the space. And so we may not know exactly the width of the browser at any given moment, but that calc property is going to make sure that this stays nice and fluid. If we get too small, it's going to start wrapping and such. So, there may be other strategies for that, but that is the calc property. So it's pretty cool. It's nice and handy. Any questions about calc? Alrighty, let's get you guys to some more lab time. So we'll keep the same breakout rooms as before. Let me Slack out your lab time. It's actually in your student labs folder, in a folder called CSS. And there's the link right there. While I'm sharing my screen, I'll go ahead and open this up over here. So this lab is pretty straightforward. This is a mock-up of a website, and this is pretty, just pretend that I'm a client and I'm hiring all of you as my dev team. This is my mock-up. This is a pretty fancy mock-up, actually, but I'm giving you this piece of collateral and I'm asking you to bring this to fruition. I don't know anything about CSS or layout or HTML, but I'm asking you guys to recreate this for my site. So if you see here, there's an image of this website. You can actually visit this site. If you scroll down to the bottom of the image, you can see the website right here. Christine and I were just looking at it, and it looks like they've updated the layout since then. But basically, the goal for the lab is just to play around and try to recreate this mock-up using what we've been over today and such. And here's a couple of touch points or talking points. So number one, you do not have to use the exact photography in this mock-up. Feel free to find your own. So if you want to use different images, different logos for like Facebook and Twitter and such, you can feel free to do that. But the spirit of this should be the same, where you have kind of an image at the top with some information on top of it, that kind of thing. Number two, do not worry about matching the fonts. So don't sweat the fonts. The goal of this is mainly to structure the HTML and try to work with the positioning of the elements. Number three, for the Get in Touch section, don't worry about creating form elements for name, email, subject, etc. Just use standard elements that we've learned about, such as divs, and style them appropriately. So this is actually probably like an HTML5 form or something. Don't worry about including a form. That's more of a stretch goal. Just play around with creating some divs and try to format them and lay them out so it resembles a form. Just want you guys to get some practice with positioning. That's really the point here. And number four, so I really doubt that you guys will get this thing finished in like an hour, and that's totally fine. Actually, don't really expect you guys to finish this, but just get as far as you can and help each other, and just play around with the positioning and CSS if you want to Google some properties and such. Just want to give you guys some more practice with this stuff. Here are some stretch goals if you do find yourself pretty far down the road. So you can research form elements and then add them to match the mock-up if you want to Google about forms. You can research fonts and find something that matches closely to the mock-up, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time on that. And then finish the entire mock-up. So that's kind of your stretch. Any questions about that? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And again, if you guys want to, feel free to do this in Atom. If you just want to create a new folder, just create an index file and a CSS file and then link them together. And just go for it. Just see how far you can get to try to mimic this layout. Any questions before we head into lab time? All right, Christine, are we all good for breakouts? She hit the button. So we're gonna hop into our instructor stand-ups and we'll see you guys around 5:30. And just hit us up if you have any questions.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
I sent you a private message.
Yes.
I had a, it's not really, it's on top of a CSS, I'm sure, but it's not really something we went over today. It was something I've been wondering.
Okay, so what's the, I just opened it. What's your question?
Yeah, so if you click on that, I really like this little effect that he put on this page. It's like when you scroll down, it becomes transparent and it kind of retracts up that header. After it's done completely loading, you can see it.
The nav bar?
Yes.
Let me try it again.
Dana and Eric, are you here or are your computers frozen? Oh, and Mark, do you mind pausing the recording?
Absolutely. Thanks for